So I have to confess to my wife, who's in the back, and to all of you here, that I met the man of my dreams yesterday. So he happens to be here now. Sweetie. So his name, you'll see why I'm saying he's the man of my dreams, because he's the man of your dreams too. In that, he is the guy who can answer all the thousands of questions we all have as to what are we going to do with this youngster after they leave McLean's 3Ds. What are we going to do in terms of education, in terms of placement, in terms of other treatment options? He knows the landscape in the United States better than anyone else in the world. He is so highly sought after that it was a miracle that we were able to capture him for a bad cleanup in today's conference. So he happens to be the Director of Clinical and Educational Services at McLean Hospital for the past 12 years. He's the man, the myth, the legend. Jim Holsomback, give him a hand.
I was worried that Alec was going to overstate my introduction. Good afternoon. The goal of the presentation I'm going to provide is to give an overview of the myriad of options that are available for care and aftercare for adolescents necessitating day of residential therapeutic environment. While each option provides different advantages and disadvantages, there's some overarching factors that are important to consider when evaluating what type of placement is best. Some of the information I'm going to talk about in terms of categories are going to kind of follow these 5 categories of options for aftercare placement. Some of the information that I'm going to give is going to be generalized. Obviously, everything's not going to be absolutely true in terms of the specific schools or programs within a specific category. I will try and touch upon the range of services provided within each category, knowing that some schools or programs are going to fall outside of that range. The first and most important thing and question that you want to evaluate when deciding what category or program you're looking for, what are the initial goals? What needs to be accomplished? Is the placement going to be assessment driven? Is it for containment? Is it working toward extinguishing a specific behavior that's precluding a student from going to the placement that you actually would like to see them in? There's certainly times when it's likely that the family may want to pursue 2 or even 3 of the categories and eliminate options based on the willingness of the client, the cost of the services, the ability for a client to be accepted into a program. And this is an integral time when sort of deciding what categories you'd like to pursue. To try and collaborate with the adolescent, the family, outpatient treatment teams, and schools, and educational consultants can certainly provide additional support and guidance as well at this time. Secondly, this is going to feel like putting the cart miles ahead of the horse, but it's really vital to look at where the team and family would like to see the adolescent be placed after the initial placement is complete. The goal is to have an adolescent go directly to college or a gap year program. We want to make sure that the initial placement is going to have a pre-independent living or life skills component. The student's going to be returning home, going to a therapeutic day placement. It's going to be important that first placement is going to have the skills necessary to have them return home, doing work with the parents in terms of support, contingency management, a lot of home passes. If the second step is unknown, it's going to be really good to select a program with a strong assessment component to help identify the best range of options for the adolescent and family. Finally, so we can move on from this slide, I cannot emphasize this enough, you are placing the entire family. Family members need to be ready to sign up for the entire program. This is going to include family visits, family programs, skills training, going to the placement site, having passes home, and following all the rules that the program is going to set forth. It also includes making sure that the length of stay matches and the cost of the program matches something that's actually doable for the family. I can't really explain how many great programs and really good placements get undermined because the family is really not on board for 1 or 2 components within that placement. Finding a way to negotiate the idea that the entire program is being referred for treatment, the entire family is being referred for treatment at the outset of the placement will ensure that the placement is going to have a chance to be successful. Lots of options. This is an overwhelming and unwanted process to look at placing someone outside of the home. It's going to be important to have the entire family on board, and it's also going to important to make sure that the people that are the primary communicators, and that the decision makers are actually able to communicate and have the capacity to make decisions. For those that are not familiar with the newer wave of therapeutic wilderness placements, try and expunge the idea of the 300-pound ex-Marine yelling at adolescents to drop down and give you 20. These programs do exist. They're not the ones we're going to be discussing today. The purpose of therapeutic wilderness programs is to work with clients who need a quick admission, who benefit from action over cognition activities, do well with physical activity, could really benefit from immediate feedback, and can benefit from a natural consequence model. Natural consequence models rely on feedback as it occurs in real time and in the real world. If you woke up late this morning, natural consequences are maybe you skipped breakfast, or maybe you came late for Dr. Zanarini's talk. The idea behind the natural consequences is that something's going to happen as a result of that behavior. Wilderness programs are set up to amplify this idea and process it in real time as well as metaphorically. If a client gets up late in a wilderness program, they may not have time to ensure that their backpack is weighted evenly for a 3-mile hike. A mile into the hike, their back may start hurting. They may be listing to one side. They might be falling behind the rest of the group. The group would then have to stop and find out why the client is having trouble keeping up. The natural consequence for the individual is their back may hurt. The group may be frustrated with them. And this is going to result in sort of a quick standing 10-minute group to kind of process what's going on. The natural consequence for the group is that they have to stop and actually have a group. They may be late to their site that day, and they might have to actually set up in the dark. The individual and group are then going to process how and why they ended up in the situation that they did, and sort of how moving forward they might be able to prevent that. They're also going to use the situation metaphorically to talk about how a lack of preparation, in this case, might have gotten in the way of people accomplishing goals at home or in the real world. Time-wise, wilderness programs are typically looking at a 6 to 12 week time period. The average length of stay is approximately 50 days. For some therapeutic residential schools in particular, a couple residential treatment centers, it can fulfill a prerequisite. Many schools like to use wilderness programs as prerequisites because they sort of grab the adolescent's attention. They can soften externalizing behaviors and increase motivation for the next placement, even if it's just to have running water. Wilderness programs have the capacity to complete testing, typically it's done by outside consulting psychologists. They're usually fairly high quality and have a really quick turnaround, so it can actually be useful for the next placement. Wilderness programs can work with willing or unwilling clients. So for some programs use transportation or escort services for unwilling participants. Can help avoid a chaotic detachment of the program's location. The cost is approximately $350 to $450 per day. So depending on the cost and the length of stay of the program, the range for cost is going to be about $18,000 to $30,000 for a stay. Therapeutic, in terms of how the therapeutic services are delivered, they can be anything from hard wilderness skills, which I'll discuss in a second, to about 15 hours a week of individual and group-based work. Therapy wilderness programs can be delivered by trail guides or licensed clinicians in the field. Clients are also asked to complete homework in between therapy sessions, which could be anything from 12-step reading, letter writing to parents, including I feel statements, or writing letters to those that may have been affected by the adolescent's behavior. Hard wilderness skills, as I mentioned before, they're designed to be tests that typically no one's going to be able to do on the first few or many times of trying. But through practice and discipline, people can kind of figure out how to complete them, how to master them, and then how to teach them to the group as well. They include things like fire building, shelter building, trap, and site maintenance. Wilderness programs can be campus-based, nomadic, or have a mixed model. Typically, campus-based programs can be used for kids that are have a little more acuity in terms of their behaviors or psychiatric symptoms, also for kids that have more medical difficulties, diabetes, things of that nature. The campus-based services, typically the wilderness activity will take place during the day, but the adolescents are going to return back to the campus that day from which they came. Nomadic programs are programs where there is no campus and kids are going in basically a giant circle for their entire stay. And about every 4 to 5 days per week, they'll actually change campsites. And then a mixed model, obviously, would be a combination of those two. Transportation individuals, they can range from very relational intervention style services that can take hours or even days to complete to a more physically based mandated escort service. Transportation services can also be used for willing participants based on the requirements of the receiving program, potential anticipated anger toward parents, or if the adolescent were to request a transportation service versus being transported by their parents. There are a few wilderness programs that will not work with transportation services, so for unwilling clients, they're going to be a difficult match. Family components, wilderness programs range from skill teaching, experientially based activities, letter writing, and phone sessions with the adolescent's therapist. For wilderness programs that have an experiential component, parents actually go to the wilderness program for 2 to 4 days and engage in a similar treatment facility and are working on skills that approximate the adolescent's experience. It can be helpful for the parents to have a shared experience, and sometimes the adolescents like to feel like the parent has some force and empathy for the experience that they're going through. Wilderness programs work hard to have some separation between them through their sort of program niche. Some of these include organic farming, holistic models, more sort of extreme physical activity models, school integration, and addiction-based models. Therapeutic residential schools, the goal of which is, it's important to look at the goal. There are therapeutic residential schools that really specialize in containment and compliance, and then more regularly, certainly for the clients that we've been discussing, the goal will really be largely therapeutic and educational. The second consideration is whether residential school can be necessary because home is unworkable due to the parent-child relationship, addiction or trauma issues at home, or psychiatric limitations of the family. This option can be best where there's a lot of motivation to attend a therapeutic residential school by both the family and the adolescent, or when there are deficits in parents or the home situation just make it difficult to receive the quality or the amount of therapeutic services that are needed while living at the home. It's also an option when 24-hour support, not treatment, support is needed when the social and extracurricular components of the school cannot be achieved in a therapeutic day setting. In terms of academic rigor and support, adolescents with learning differences are typically well treated in residential schools. Often they have additional academic supports to accommodate students. Also, unstructured time is really functional in residential schools and can serve to fill school, social, and leisure skill deficits for clients that are attending. In terms of admissions, parents and therapists typically know kids better than anyone, so use that information to try and problem solve areas of difficulty based on past history. If a client has had difficulty with roommate situations in the past, it'd be important information for the school to know. Also to find out how schools are going to negotiate those sorts of difficulties when a student actually is attending the school. So again, a great time to have a team-oriented attitude, utilizing all supports, the family, the client themselves, schools, and therapists and consultant viewpoints. I can't emphasize this enough, but please be honest with the receiving school. Hiding behaviors really doesn't help anyone. Hiding a history around substance use, self-injury, eating disorder behaviors, etc., only is going to really ensure that supports won't be in place if or when those behaviors emerge again. And the school will be frustrated about the lack of information if it does. Bad placements or placements that need to be assessed or replaced just increase the stress, the time, the financial commitments for the entire family. It can hurt academic progress and create crises for placements that at best can be stressful and chaotic, at worst they can be dangerous. Considerations around therapeutic residential schools. It's important that the threshold of a therapeutic school has to hospitalize or expel a student. Sometimes therapeutic residential schools can actually have pretty low thresholds because unlike therapeutic day schools, there's no outpatient team in which to rely. And unlike residential treatment centers, they can't serve as a locked setting. Eating disorder behaviors are probably the most difficult behaviors to place in most therapeutic residential settings because they don't have the necessary protocols to put in place to monitor eating disorder behaviors or to look at the medical side of it around BMIs and weigh-ins and monitoring weights. This is going to sound fairly harsh, but I'm not a huge advocate of really making any decisions around the distance from home. never allowing that to be a stumbling block in terms of finding a good therapeutic residential school. We're not traveling by horse and buggy. A plane ride can cover, in 6 hours, can cover the length of the country, and jumping in a car really is going to get you about 400 miles. So really, having the good match in the therapeutic residential school is going to be much more important than the distance from home. A real consideration, however, is how close the school is to services, particularly if they're going to be services that are going to be accessed within the community. Recreational services, potentially inpatient services, if there's a community nutritionist that needs to be accessed, it's important to know how close those services are going to be with the school and the likelihood that the student is actually going to be able to access their students those services while they're a student in the school. In terms of the sacredness in academics and therapy, it's good to know sort of if one service can interrupt the other. Are academics or therapy going to be more important? The student is being willful in academics. Is that going to affect the amount of time they have in therapy, or is it going to affect the residential component? Also, as well, it's really important to know whether the skills coaching or therapist is available during academic time. If it's a student that typically has a lot of crisis points. A lot of disparity between school life and therapeutic residential schools. Social activities can be fairly varied, and it's really good to make sure that you can match social activities going to match students' interests or strengths. Recreational activities, making sure that they're therapeutically useful, or at least they're preparatory in terms of getting ready for the next placement, and that activities are actually enjoyable. Home visits are a really important aspect of therapeutic residential schools, particularly if students are going to be returning home after the placement is complete. In addition to asking about the logistical parts of home passes, like how long after a student arrives at the school are they going to happen, and if there's things that need to be accomplished before home visits can be achieved, it's really important to the school's capacity to prepare students, and even more importantly, the family prior to, during, or after a pass from the therapeutic school occurs. And if there are crisis points, if there's support that's available from the school during the pass while the student is at home. And then just initial phase restrictions, kind of touched upon, but just if there are periods of time that take place prior to a student being allowed on a home visit, it's really important if they're home for Christmas and you're placed in on December 10th, it's great to have that information ahead of time. Finding a balance. It's not a perfect balance, nor is it a perfect slide, but as a general rule, as you put additional weight on the academic portion of the school, you're going to take some of the emphasis away from the therapeutic value of the school and vice versa. Typically, schools that have more of a therapeutic value are not quite as comprehensive or sophisticated in terms of their academic services. One component that's not really emphasized on the slide, but is the behavioral component. In general, the more behavioral a program is, typically the less academic and less therapeutic a program tends to be. All right, moving on to residential treatment centers. RTCs typically work with clients that are less motivated, need to have the capacity to serve as a locked setting when needed. Typically, they'll work with transportation services, prioritize containment and safety, and often use a pretty behavioral approach to achieve such goals. Recently, there has been a growing trend to have more clinically enriched RTC programs, which is really moving in the right direction. Academically, RTC programs tend to be less rigorous than their therapeutic residential school and therapeutic day school counterparts. There's less availability for academic supports if needed. Students that are enrolled in a residential treatment center program typically are looking to transition to another therapeutic setting upon discharge versus going home. And most likely the destination is going to be a therapeutic residential school or a therapeutic day school. It's pretty unlikely that a residential treatment center would discharge a student directly at home. Residential treatment centers often rely on point systems that have more of a capacity to offer immediate feedback to clients, and are often more CBT oriented in terms of their theoretical orientation. In terms of supervision, residential treatment center programs generally are more highly structured, offer more supervision of clients, less autonomy, and have the capacity to provide one-to-one support when necessitated. Considerations around RTC, just sort of when and how often it's going to be serving as a locked facility. Again, level systems tend to be more synonymous with therapeutic residential schools, therapeutic day schools. and program-oriented facilities versus RTCs that tend to be more point system and sort of immediate feedback systems. RTCs are less likely to have the wilderness program be a prerequisite because they have the capacity to be locked. And the models can be more privilege-based or discipline or behaviorally based, and it's good to know to make sure that the model for the residential treatment center is utilizing matches the strengths or the needs of each of the students being placed. And finally, restraint training. Great to know how the training is done, by whom, how often people are being trained, under what circumstances are restraints employed, if there's nursing of staff available 24 hours a day, if restraints are going to be completed at the program. All right, moving toward home. Therapeutic day schools. The purpose of therapeutic day school is really to be able to provide an academic setting and structure that's going to be fairly similar to what a public school would provide in terms of curriculum, with the added benefit of having therapeutic eyes on during the school day. They can be very individualized in terms of the amount of therapy and the rigor of the academics. This is probably where the balance between therapy and academics is the most prominent. Therapeutic schools can be paid for through local school systems where the student is enrolled. A student must be enrolled in the town school system to be eligible to receive financial support to go to a therapeutic day school, and they also must qualify for an emotional disability or learning disability to be eligible for those services and money. They can also be paid for privately. Generally, the therapeutic school prefers to have the funding arrangement settled on ahead of time to allow to know who the payer is, and if the local school system is going to be providing payment for that, they kind of like to know ahead of time. Assessment placements are another type of placement that can be completed at a therapeutic day school. Typically, they're 30 to 45 days in length, and there's usually a couple questions that a school would be looking to answer over that 30 to 45 days. At the conclusion of the assessment placement, the therapeutic day school would provide feedback for whoever was asking for the assessment in terms of those goals that were set at the outset of the placement. It sounds like a terrible option to have a 30-day school placement, but more times than not, for students that are in a therapeutic day environment for an assessment, that they really need the therapeutic day school services, and that is often the recommendation of the assessment. For families that need adolescents in a therapeutic day school placement, but the school does not believe that they meet services for an emotional disability, there are certainly educational advocates that can be really useful in helping negotiate those needs with the school system. There's also a growing number of educationally based attorneys that specialize in special education law, including emotional disabilities, although the cost of such services can be prohibitive. The benefit of a therapeutic day school versus a therapeutic residential school, the residential treatment center, is that it's possible to utilize a typically larger amount of community supports to supplement services that aren't provided by the therapeutic day school. So if the school is really strong in terms of providing support around substance use, community services can be supplemented to give additional support or services or groups around difficulties around self-injury. Individual and group-based services can be pretty individualized for the client and family needs in communities, and generally there's going to be a higher quality and higher quantity of services in the community than those found at therapeutic day schools or therapeutic residential schools or RTCs. Therapeutic focus for therapeutic day schools, typically questions around how many hours of therapy are provided, what the focus and the orientation are of the treatment that's being provided, how much individual and group time is provided for the students while they're in the school, and most therapeutic day schools also require an outpatient treatment team so they can support work that's being done in the therapeutic day school. Behavioral considerations for therapeutic day schools, again, whether there's a point or a level system, how much milieu support is available, and then access to a therapist or skills coaching, whether that's an available service within the school. Structural considerations, how much supervision is provided with the school, again, the milieu support and academic support, and whether it can be provided within school hours or potentially after school hours for students that may need that. Considerations, most of these are self-explanatory, but important ones to focus on learning disability accommodations. Most teachers in therapeutic day schools are trained to work with students that have learning differences, but it's important to see if they are certified and if there are teachers that can actually work with a specific learning disability of the client that's being placed. Also important to know what available academics and academic and learning disability support is available beyond school hours. Skipping down to the required time for credits in graduation. Ultimately, as most of you probably know, sometimes there's missed school prior to replacement. Students can come in with asymmetrical transcripts where they may have finished 10th grade math but have a half a year of 10th grade English. Therapeutic day schools can be really helpful in terms of supplementing the education by providing a summer session or additional focus in a subject area where to make sure the transcripts become more symmetrical and that they'll be able to sort of have enough credits to pass that year or graduate from high school. School life and extracurriculars is sort of a weakness for therapeutic day schools. Typically, therapeutic day schools are pretty weak in sports, arts, music, foreign language, and physical education. It's important to check and see if their interests, clubs, and extracurriculars can be supplemented in the community, and then depending on the home school system, it's possible that students can join the local school system to be able to participate in sports or art activities that they may provide. Pulling it all together. Okay, focusing on the parent component, and this is really going across all the programs that we discussed. Great to assess how much support is going to be given to the parents. As previous speakers have pointed out, just the amount of support that can be given to the family outside of the placement, whether that's through skills teaching, whether that's through support or parent guidance, the more the better. Really, there can't be enough support around families during placement time. Also, family meetings and family therapy, how often they're provided, and recommendations or mandates from the receiving school as to how often they will happen. And pass planning for students that are going to be coming home for passes, whether the school has the capacity and how they prepare families for passes prior to as well as after. Program integrity, training and supervision is really important. It's one of the first questions I think it's important to ask the school is how much supervision is provided for their clinicians and teachers. Again, as people have pointed out, it can be really taxing work, and it's good to know that all of the people that are doing frontline work are going to be adequately supported, trained, and supervised. Amount of time and clinical hours are going to be provided for students that are in the program. The theoretical orientation obviously will be important to match that to a student's needs or deficits. Making sure that the program is using evidence-based models so they have a reason to do what they're doing and that they're actually good at doing it. In terms of planning ahead, again, that what next and what's going to happen after the initial placement is done is going to be really key, as well as contingency management, helping parents plan if they get an awful phone call or if they get a letter, sort of making sure that parents are prepared to deal with that and manage that on their own and sort of helping to do some of that parent training. Other questions upon discharge when placements are done, parents are going to want to know how they can approximate a 24-hour support in their home, and most parents obviously don't want to provide a one-bed residential out of their house. So it's going to be good to make sure that there's a way that parents can replicate the success that students have received in a therapeutic placement. Finally, annoying and important factors. Finances is sort of the ugly theme for today, just to make sure that families have a way to pay for programs, whether it's accessing the local school system as a therapeutic day or residential school, or making sure that the finances can actually see an entire program through. Making sure that the current milieu of students that are in a school actually is going to be a good match for the student that's being placed. The student has a willingness to the level that a school is going to be willing to work with that student. That if there are individual differences or needs that fall outside of the scope of what the school typically provides, that those can be accommodated to within the school or in the community. And finally, just that reminder that we are placing the entire family. All right, last section, clinical treatment programs. They can be very specialized and offer the most eclectic offerings in terms of therapy. They can deal with a lot of those unpopular behaviors that accompany BPD that often are ruled outs at therapeutic day schools, therapeutic residential schools, and some RTC programs. They have a varying amount of education, although when looking at clinical treatment programs, education generally is not the focus or what they're going to be working on. It's going to be much more sophisticated and intense in terms of the treatment services. Treatment programs can be a great stepping stone for therapeutic day schools and therapeutic residential schools in terms of that what next question. Great variations in quality. It's important to evaluate the psychiatry and nursing components as well as the professional training and supervision that's needed for high quality treatment, ensure that they actually address what the family and client need treatment for. Again, in terms of track record, clinical treatment programs can be very useful for providing periods of stability around personal safety, substance use, eating disorder behaviors, and sobriety. Go through quickly. There are a lot of DBT-informed programs that vary where staff can read Marcia's Lenahan or go to a 2-day conference and say that they're doing DBT treatment. It's really important to make sure that the program you're selecting, if you're looking at a DBT-related program, has the 4 necessary program components to make sure that it's actually doing real DBT treatment. The individual DBT therapy skills training and consultation team for therapists and after-hours skills coaching. And treatment programs generally have a better capacity really to treat BPD in a clinical sense, much more so than therapeutic day schools, therapeutic residential schools, because they're really worried about the academic component, or residential treatment centers, which typically are in locked settings. Treatment programs can be really integral in preparing students for school settings, either day or residential, because of those unpopular behaviors that typically treatment programs have a better capacity to treat. Again, DBT programs and treatment programs are really good at being able to have identifiable goals at the outset of treatment and be able to sort of assess and figure out what that next placement is going to be early and often during the client's stay. And finally, family participation, again, a theme throughout people's presentations. It's really essential to assess future capacity involvement for the family and how supportive they're going to be able to be for the client. Questions and considerations. I'm not actually going to go through these because I think most people are probably literate. And there's some resources on the back page. Then